Constitutional attorney Mark Smith joins me now. He served on President Trump's first transition team. I'm so glad to have you with us. Give me your perspective on the rhetoric you have heard from the president and those close to him about Alex Pretti being in possession of a firearm at a protest.
Well, I think the press secretary, Caroline Levitt, said it correctly when she points out you absolutely have a Second Amendment right to bring a firearm to a public protest or a demonstration or a march, any of these things. But of course, there is a line that can be crossed, Major, where you go from just simply using a gun or possessing a gun into the misuse of a gun. And there's longstanding American history that says that you're not allowed to use arms, for example, to engage in riots or affrays. And the question here is whether or not what's going on in some of these instances in Minnesota, whether or not this has crossed the line from simply public protest into some form of a riot or an affray. And the Trump administration, based on their rhetoric, Major, seems to think that in many instances, these are attempts to directly impede or interfere with law enforcement, and that crosses the line between merely using a firearm versus misusing a firearm. And of course, the Second Amendment does not protect the misuse of a firearm, it only protects the lawful use of it.
Implied, though, in that, Mark, is that if you're impeding, you should be arrested, not shot dead.
Well, right. Of course, obviously, step one is if you're impeding or interfering with law enforcement, then you should be arrested. But again, turns on the perspective of the law enforcement officer. If the law enforcement officer perceives you to be engaging in something that is a deadly threat to him or her, or is placing you at risk of serious bodily harm, then basic rules of self-defense and all the state laws indicate that you are allowed to respond with deadly force if you perceive yourself in danger. That, of course, is very much a question of fact. And as to what happened in Minneapolis, that's what the investigations are supposed to tell us about, Major, whether or not that was a legitimate act of self-defense or not.
Mark, I have read several in the gun rights advocates community who have expressed some measure of alarm about the rhetoric that they have seen from either President Trump or those close to him about Alex Pretti. Do you share that alarm?
No, I don't, because I'm a big believer that actions speak much more loudly than words do. So if you have an administration official like, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who makes some comment that is not a particularly nuanced comment involving the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, it doesn't bother me at all because, sometimes they answer questions sort of a little bit outside of their subject matter expertise. So no, it doesn't bother me at all. And if you look at the actions of the Trump administration, they've been very pro-Second Amendment. Everything from challenging, various gun bans in the District of Columbia to filing amicus briefs in the Third Circuit, in the Seventh Circuit, very favorable against state gun bans. So basically, if you look at the actions of the Trump administration when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, it's very favorable, very positive. So no, I don't really hold a stray comment made by someone in the administration, walking to Marine One or walking down the street or in some quick interview. I don't put a lot of weight on that one way or the other.
How about the DHS secretary describing Alex Pretti as a domestic terrorist, or Stephen Miller, a top advisor to the president on immigration matters, calling him a would-be assassin when the firearm, as all the video evidence appears to indicate, never left his waistband?
Well, again, this is a question of what does the investigation uncover? And I'm not in a position to say one way or the other. Maybe they have access to information from their federal investigation that has not been made public yet. We don't know that. But as to the characterization, that is their opinions, and they're entitled to their opinions. But as I sit here right now, Major, I don't have a particular opinion one way or the other than he was obviously there. He obviously had a firearm. Something happened. And again, as a matter of common sense, if you're going to place yourself into a situation where you may be physically touching law enforcement, you got to be very careful in those situations, because even if you don't intend any ill harm, your conduct could be perceived as a problem, and mistakes do happen, and you don't want to be in a situation where you place yourself into a situation where a mistake by someone can cost you your life. It's just common sense in my view, Major.
But just to put a finer point on this, Mark, and then I'll let you go. If you have if you're possessing a firearm legally and you're at a protest, you are not by definition just being with a firearm legally at a protest doing something unlawful, dangerous, or unwise.
That's right. If you simply have a firearm and you're possessing it and you're at the Women's Rights March, or you're marching or you're protesting or you're cheering for something, that's perfectly consistent with the history of the Second Amendment. It's perfectly fine. If you cross a line, though, into misuse of the firearm, you have a problem. And on the example I like to give, Major, if you walk into a bank with a gun, you're perfectly legally allowed to do so if you're bringing it there for self-defense. However, if you bring the gun out of your pocket, you start waving it around, you start demanding money, you start acting in that kind of way, you probably have now crossed the line from simply using the gun defensively and lawfully into a territory where you're misusing a gun and you're asking for trouble, and you shouldn't do that. And it breaks the law in many instances, of course.
On that bait example, I think we would all agree. Mark Smith, I appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Thanks, Major.